so that women can be in an equal footing. And then there are many biases that even become previous to the political system, because you have the reflection in parliaments and the fact that only 19% of parliamentarians are women. But this starts before, and most women live, and humans live in rural areas. And in spite of the fact that there are matriarchal systems in traditional systems, not all traditional systems are matriarchal. And the contradiction is not necessarily between modernity and tradition, because modernity has brought to the forefront women's rights. So one has to be careful with this. I think that the main problem is women contribute over 80% of the food in some countries, yet own as little as 2% of the land.
Right.
So this is the general picture. For whatever reason, colonialism has part of it, but it's not the whole story.
Right.
So there's also issues with religion, because religion does not have to be identified with patriarchy. Although, because of social systems in which certain religions have become dominant, some religions have become a lot closer to acts of usurpation of the rights of women. And then there are very specific issues to do with violence against women that we're not really addressing with sufficient clarity, because violence against women is an enormous problem, and reparation in case of war and conflict resolution has to be really center stage in our concern, because land grabbing and warmongering today, especially in continents like Africa and some parts of Asia, are key, and conflict resolution and the role of women in conflict resolution. And for example, the contribution of women to the Irish peace process in the negotiation towards the overcoming of the violence of the IRA, and the women's movement role in that, and how this has happened in many societies. This is really key to today's world. And I think that the broad problem is equal access to resources, because if you have equal access to resources, then even if you don't have positive discrimination in the favor of women in systems that don't allow for that, or you don't have a tradition which is matriarchal, or where there's more gender neutrality in a society, if you have equality of access to resources, that is empowerment. That is the source of power.
And credit is one of those resources,
of course,
if I may just
certainly
throw that in. Women have, in these areas, have no, I can't say none, but very little access to credit. So they can't, what are they working with? So until we worldwide allow women, and the word allow is so, you know, it's the wrong word for me to use, because why should I be allowed credit? You know, I live in a democracy. Women should be equal to men. If you have credit, can get credit, I can get credit. Microfinancing has been one of these, you know, has addressed this issue in many ways, and has certainly helped small groups to become more wealthy in some, you know, to contribute to the income of the community. And that's incredibly important. We can't have communities where half of the population is not contributing, not because they don't want to, not because they can't, but because they're not allowed to. Imagine what could happen.
Well, I mean, and that's not adjunct to what Janice said, and also something that I can want to reply to the UN Women's assertion that, of course, the prevailing circumstances, family circumstances, or you know, situations in the world at this point is that we have mostly patriarchal societies. Okay, but that notwithstanding, a lot needs to be learned from matriarchal societies, because I'm very sure that if these matriarchal societies became models or were learned from, and the positive aspects actually utilized, by way of making women very prominent in governance and policy, I think the situation could have been different. Okay, I'm not saying that we have to apply everything, but at least there has to be some studies made in that system also, and there has to be something to be taken from the positives in that system.
Right.
Indigenous knowledge is a resource not only in that area, but also in areas of management of the environment,
not even
and also in the right
of business,
and in food security, and in food access,
education.
And education.
Education.
And education is very important, not only in terms of incorporation of women, but the education of women, especially young girls, has an enormous affinity, especially quality education, and this is very well established, with a reduction of teenage pregnancies, and with a reduction of high rates of high reproductive rates. And this is very important in terms of control of population explosion. So for the equilibrium in the world, for the correct approach to reproduction, for a sustainable reproduction, the education of young girls is a key issue.
Exactly.
It has to start in primary school.
So if somebody says educate a woman and you educate the entire village, okay?
That's true.
Yes, it is very true.
It is true. It is true.
Actually, what I can take from this conversation is that we agree, for example, that there is a disproportionate treatment of women, I mean, compared to men, that women are being discriminated against in certain areas, and their rights are denied in certain areas. Some of these things, even though some of them are cultural, some of them are also current issues that perhaps we should be able to really deal with in terms of policy formulation and implementation and so on. So I think you raise an important issue about violence against women and women in conflict zones. This is critical because I also believe that women do have a role to play in peace building and conflict prevention, management and resolution. And having said that, I also recall some time ago in one West African country or something, like that, I can't really remember, women had to fight, seek for peace by organizing themselves, even refusing to sleep with their husbands as a way of making sure that these men stop fighting. And whether it worked or not, but it kind of showed the impact women can have if they come together to say, okay, we want to pursue peace. And however that thing worked, importantly, it sent a signal that women want peace and they have a weapon they can use to really, approach peace. As a woman, how will you be able to look at situations like that, especially in the context of the fact that if war breaks, women are most vulnerable. Women and children are really most vulnerable in war situations and all that. So are there ways, for example, women can really play a more active role in conflict prevention and peace building?
Yes, because I think women, even starting in the young ages with youth, women talk about their issues. Or I'll say girls talk about their issues. Boys resolve issues with force. You can look at any elementary school, anywhere in the world, and you will see boys physically fighting. Now, in some areas, unfortunately, they have more than just their fists to use. Whereas girls have, we yell at each other. But we come to a resolution with our words and not with force. And that is a lesson that we can take from early childhood. And if we help young boys embrace that thought, that there are other ways to resolve conflict than through force, than through violence, but through conversations and through words at an early age, as boys grow up with women, with girls as their models, we will generate populations where violence against women is decreased and hopefully eventually ends.
But this has a lot to do also with mixed gender education in the schools. Because in order to create that environment, sex segregation in schooling goes completely against it.
Right.
And
Absolutely.
it also has a lot to do with civil culture, not just formal education, and promoting this integration since very little, starting in the family. And
The family's a
the
huge part
equality
of it.
within the family is very
Huge.
important. And the
Huge.
sharing of power and resources and entitlements within the family
Right.
is key.
I totally agree. It
Very
can't just be,
important.
there's always a, you know, in any education, with any education, there has to be the actual education and the family. And if the two do not connect, you will not produce what you are trying to achieve.
And the best model is community schooling, community public schools, run by the community, where the families and the community and the school
Are all
come
together.
together.
Yes.
And not even the best private schools can beat a good experiment of that nature.
No, I agree with
Okay,
you.
I think that we're almost getting into seeking solutions to some of these perceived inequality issues and stuff like that. And much as some of them, like we talked about, focus on policy issues, you know, in terms of laws of countries and so on and so forth. We also are discussing how some of these can really be dealt with from early childhood and stuff like that, which perhaps will be more enduring. And when we look at some policy issues, my mind just goes quickly to somewhere in Saudi Arabia, you know, where recently they changed the policy that says that women could not drive. Now, I think they have changed the policy. And there are a lot of such, you know, terrible policies that exist, especially in the Middle East, that somehow seem to discriminate against women. I'm also informed that even in Qatar, for example, for a woman to travel out of the country, you have to get permission from your husband. Otherwise, you'll be stopped at immigration points. So some are crucial policy issues that do exist and that do, unfortunately, affect women's rights and freedom. So these are issues that we can deal with, you know, laws, policies, and so on and so forth. So while we are discussing some of these issues, can we look at some of these encumbrances and look at solutions, what can really be done to change the dynamic, to give women freedom and basic rights?
Well, I think just as Francisco said, that, you know, the family has to be involved in the education. I think countries have to share amongst each other what has worked for them, and take those ideas, adapt them to the culture of the culture of the other country, have women involved in this, because it's what we're really good at among millions of other things, but peacemaking, peacekeeping, resolutions, and education, and allowing different people of different thoughts to open up their minds to see how other people have made this a successful part of their culture, and to see the benefits in terms of more income, more produce, more democratic ways of living, contributes to the society as a whole. And if you live in an area where you know nothing about this, how are you going to learn about it? So through media, you know, and through country sharing, I think, is an important way to help.
You want to come in?
Yeah, I want to come in here. There has been a lot of deliberations on women's rights, you know, from the early 20th century times, from Susan Anthony, voting rights, and then later on the 60s, the women's slave movements,
Right.
and then civil rights movements, all of which were aimed at actually bringing to the fore the issues of rights, not only of women, but of all peoples.
That's what I call
Right.
mainstream.
Mainstream
mediation.
mediation.
Exactly.
And I think, you see, in some cases, women were not particularly engaged, you know, as the major focus, because it became mainstream, and other peoples, minorities, blacks and Hispanics and other people, you know, were pushing for more rights, which was fair and okay because they were denied their rights too, you know. But the women's rights, which have always been ignored in every society, black, white, green, or whatever, have always, even up as we speak, has always been something that continues to be a major issue. Okay, we are speaking about issues of governance and policy, and we just said that we have just about, you know, globally we have only about 19% of women in the legislatures of the world, and I'm very sure within the executive positions in governance, we have just even fewer numbers, you know. And so what I think, see, most of these things should begin from certain levels in society, from the family. We are speaking about husbands having been forced to sleep in the
where they belong.
Having to
Just kidding.
sleep in the couch overnight or for some time. It may not necessarily be a panacea to the problem, but I think certain recognitions, and this is something which is even more policy involved than anything. We have marriage counselors all over the place among various religious groups, churches, mosques, and synagogues. But what do? Every marriage counselor is looking at the husband as the head of the family, even though probably the breadwinner in the family may be what? The woman.
Yeah, actually,
okay. Please. So see, the thing is that many of these things and the power, and see that there's so much is involved in the power relations between men and women, to the point that even the women themselves sometimes surrender whichever power they possess to the men because of tradition, because of religion,
fear, and
so many other things.
And because lack of rights. And
exactly.
But we have to get into a more prescriptive mode.
That's what I'm saying.
And a general recommendation, and this is a recommendation in the voluntary directives to the right to food. States should concede priority to distribution of food aid through women as a means to reinforce its function and in the adoption of decisions and guaranteeing that food is used to satisfy the feeding needs of homes. That's a practical solution, and it's very important around the world. Then we've talked about the need of involving women in land use policy so that their needs are being taken. That's another very important chunk. We've talked about mixed education and community schooling. We've talked about people-centered land governance and essential to address the needs of land users and the discrimination of many different vulnerable groups, especially women. And there's on the other side, on the stopping of the major disasters that are happening and that will have enormous effects, is the denouncing of land grabbing, whether international or national, and violation of human rights, particularly the equal rights of women.
That is why I started. That's why I started from several organizations and several conferences that have been held for women's rights. And in fact, the highlights of women's rights was the Beijing conference in 1993, which spelled out all these things, these prescriptions we are talking about here. But what happened?
But go ahead.
There's one word, I think, that just needs to be enforced: accountability. Where is the accountability?
When there are to whom, and who has to enforce the accountability?
The government, people, whoever, you know, all of us. There is no accountability for whether it be constitutional laws, legislative laws, policy laws, electoral reform. If there is no accountability, it's just paper.
You know, the women's issues are, honestly, sometimes I see some contradictions in that. I went through a book called The Anatomy of Female Powers. And what I take from that book also is that women are so powerful in the world that they even control people, through other means. Like women. In fact, it says that men are even controlled by women. It's either you're controlled by your wife or whatever you're doing. All the struggles you're doing in this world is
but
about,
look at it the
is
other
about
side.
your wife. It's either your mother or your girlfriend.
And what's wrong with that?
No, it's not wrong. What I'm saying is that, and yet, women's issues are not really put at the center stage. And another dimension also is that I've also come across some, information that suggests that somehow women's problems are really themselves. That it seems.
I've read that. Come on.
It seems like sometimes, let's say you want to run for the presidency of the United States.
I can.
You discover that most of your problems will be women, not even men. So.
Well, I agree with you. I absolutely agree with you. It is that some men. We believe, there have been many articles written about the reason that Hillary Clinton, didn't win the nomination was because not enough women voted for her. I don't think it had to do, because every woman I've spoken to, every poll I've seen, so many women and men, were behind her for her. I think she's a brilliant woman, in her ability to enforce policies. I think there is still, I think you are right, I think there is still a mindset that we are not as good as, or we cannot, even though we want it. We've been taught through generations and generations and generations, you are not as good as. You can't do as much as. So I think we've come so far, but I hear what you're saying, and I do think it is a mental mindset.
So in other words,
to
alleviate that kind of situation.
Yes.
Probably you guys may agree that perhaps there's need to kind of educate women to really understand that their problems are in their hands, that they can do better.
But not only.
No,
you also have to
I'm saying,
change the structure
exactly.
of power.
Sure. No, because if, for example, women, you decide to run for public office, for example, first of all, you have to take that decision by yourself to say, I want to change things. And if you stay there and say, oh, because men are in control, I don't want to go there. So obviously, men cannot force it to come and get involved in decision-making processes. So women do have to really.
Well, we have been, but you see that around the world, it has gotten better. I mean,
let's look at the problems. Let's look at the problem. For example, Germany and Merkel. Okay, Merkel could be seen as an example of women becoming presidents. But then women in Germany, and there's been about a year ago a very good article on this in the New York Times, do not really have general equality, because as soon as they have children, their access to work is highly undermined. And it just so happens that Angela Merkel has no children. So if you look at it from a general point of view, the main barriers for access exist, even though there has been a major symbolic change. There hasn't been the social change that has to accompany it. The social change has to do with mentality, but mentality has a lot to do with accommodation. Women do not choose to be subservient.
Correct.
The system of patriarchy forces this upon them.
Right.
And they learn that from very little. And they get special schooling, which in many cases is of lower quality.
Well, that's why I said
they're encouraged in different ways. Not in societies like the United States as much as in more
but it starts at
traditional societies. But we have barriers too.
The next generation will hopefully not have as many of these issues as
what you are saying may be okay, but at the same time, let's look at societies like India, where Indira Gandhi became a major force in the politics of the nation. Was it because she derived that kind of power from her family? Now let's look again at the same situation in Israel. I mean, among the Jews, it's about the same thing where women are, subservient.
First of all, we had Golda Meir.
Yes, so that's what I'm talking about. Golda Meir was also a very powerful force in Israeli politics. Okay, so yes, the fact, I don't know, Golda Meir, of course, did she have children?
Yes.
Did she? She did.
She did.
Of course. Yeah. And again, you see, if you realize, it was her time that for the first time, Israel had a pact with Egypt. If you remember, I think that was the first time.
Golda Meir did amazing things
she
in
started
terms of
the peace process
exactly.
in Israel.
A woman.
You know, which was a major historic moment. You know, so however we look at it, with or without children, women are a major force. And what I believe should be done, in addition to education, is that the media have a very important part to play, a huge part to play in portraying women, you know, to society as they should be.
But then again, in some of these impoverished rural areas, women are completely illiterate. So, you know, there's a balance that has to be created, and that's again where education. Right.
As a matter of fact, time is no more our friend, yes. And I would like to take 30 seconds from each and every one of you. What do you think should be the primary solution to advancing the status of women in the world? Francisco, 30 seconds.
Well, dealing with all the tangible and the intangible barriers, and making sure that women have access to high-quality education and property and credit, and allowing women to gain high standards of education and encouraging them to take over positions of decision making and having positive discrimination towards this happening.
Janice.
I agree. I also feel, as I've said, that accountability is huge. It must be tangible. We must be able, and there must be accountability in terms of whether the laws. Again, we must participate in, women must participate in creating these laws. We have to find ways to make sure that these laws are actually being enforced, and there has to be retributions for those who break the laws.
Okay.
Well, I agree with everything you guys have said, and I will add again, like everybody has said, that education is the key. But at the same time, we need to have serious law enforcement of crimes and anything against women in society, as well as women's involvement in everything, in legislature, in the executive, in everything in society. And we also have to start developing a mindset of involving women in every aspect of the development of society.
Okay, I must thank all of you, really. And to sum it up, actually, what we have been able to agree here is that women can really play a very pivotal roles, very, very pivotal roles, actually, in reforming government, the parliament, the media, the judiciary, and every sector of our society, you know, to make them, you know, stable and responsive, inclusive, and really stimulating economic growth, you know, and strategic citizen participation, you know, that can really overhaul the entire policy agenda of most countries in such a way that, you know, it's gender sensitive, it is focused on women, because women are very important in our society, because we can't really exist without them. And as a matter of fact, it is on this note, really, that we end this edition of Many Faces, One World. Today we focused on women in public affairs and governance. And I really want to thank Francisco for coming to this program.
Thank you. And
of course, Janice, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
And Ernest, I do hope to see you next time on this program.
Thank you.
And it is on this note, dear viewer, that we wrap up today's edition of Many Faces, One World. We do hope that you join us next week when we assemble here to discuss issues. Thank you very much.